Hi everyone. Today we're going to go over some simple examples of vectors in physics. Starting out, an object is subject to a force of 50 newtons to the east and 30 newton force directed north. Determine the magnitude and direction of the resultant force. We can draw this problem out with 50 newtons going to the east and 30 newtons going north. So then the resultant will be in the north of east direction. To find the magnitude, let's use the Pythagorean theorem. This says that the resultant squared is equal to the x component squared plus the y component squared. So in this case, the resultant squared is equal to 50 squared plus 30 squared. Now, to get the resultant, we'll need to take the square root of that, which means that the resultant is simply the square root of 50 squared plus 30 squared. Which is equal to 58.3 newtons. Now to find the direction of this force, we can see that this angle here, we can use the tangent to find it. So that'll be the opposite divided by the adjacent here. If you remember SOHCAHTOA, tangent is opposite over adjacent for this angle. So the angle will be equal to the inverse tangent of 30 divided by 50. And this will give us the angle of 31 degrees. As we see from the diagram, this will be 31 degrees north of east. Now, this next question will also work as a good basic trigonometry review. A ball is thrown with an initial velocity of 20 meters a second and angle 40 degrees above the horizontal. Find the horizontal and vertical components of the initial velocity. We can use SOHCAHTOA to find the horizontal and vertical components. If we draw this out, we see that we'll need to use the cosine to find the x components and sine to find the vertical components. So this leaves us with the following equations just by using SOHCAHTOA. The horizontal velocity, or horizontal initial velocity I should say, is just equal to the initial velocity times the cosine of theta, which is 40 degrees. So this leaves us with 20 times the cosine of 40. Which is equal to about 15.3 meters a second. Now for the vertical component, we'll need to use the sine. This leaves us with 20 times sine of 40. Which is equal to about 12.9 meters a second. For this next question, a boat is propelled north at 10 meters a second in waters flowing east at 5 meters a second. Determine the boat's resultant velocity relative to the ground. We should start by drawing out this problem. We see that it'll be pointing in the east of north direction with the way that we have set up this diagram. So we can find the magnitude of the resultant using the Pythagorean theorem, which states that the resultant squared is equal to the x component squared plus the y component squared. So this means that the resultant is just equal to the square root of 10 squared plus 5 squared. And this leaves us with the value of the resultant of 11.18 meters a second. Now to find this angle theta, if you recall from trigonometry, we can use SOHCAHTOA. In this case, we'll use the tangent because we are given the opposite and the adjacent components. This means to calculate the angle theta, we can use the inverse tangent of the opposite component divided by the adjacent. And this is equal to about 26.6 degrees. And we see it is in the east of north direction, so we should specify that. In this last example, a hiker walks 4 kilometers east, then 3 kilometers north, and finally 2 kilometers west. Determine the hiker's displacement. We can draw this out. Using the tip-to-tail method, we get a good idea of the direction that this will be in. Now, we should add up the components of both the horizontal and vertical so we can redraw this diagram with 2 vectors so that we can use the Pythagorean theorem to solve for the resultant. So for the x components, letting east be positive and west be negative, we have 4 plus negative 2. Which means that the net distance traveled in the x direction is 2 kilometers. And the y direction, since there was only one vector, it only moved 3 kilometers north. Now let's redraw this diagram using these values that we just found. So it went 2 kilometers east and 3 kilometers north. Now we can use the Pythagorean theorem to solve for the resultant. If you recall, the Pythagorean theorem is the resultant squared is equal to the x component squared plus the y component squared. In this case, that means that our resultant is the square root of 2 squared plus 3 squared. Which is equal to 3.6 kilometers. Now we need to find this angle. We can use SOHCAHTOA. In this case, we'll use TOA because we are given the adjacent and the opposite angles. And this means that the angle is equal to the inverse tangent, the opposite component divided by the adjacent component. Which is equal to 56.3 degrees. And we can see from the diagram that this is in the north of east direction. So the final answer, if we write it all out, is 3.6 kilometers at 56.3 degrees north of east.